everybody. Welcome to Good Tips for Hard Times, where we find smart people who have great advice to help you get through your days. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Anita Sarkeesian. I am a media critic, public speaker, and the executive director of the Games and Online Harassment Hotline, which is a new emotional resource for gaming communities. So, as we continue our work in the streets and online and within our communities to challenge systemic racism and Black folks, I don't want to challenge Black folks. I want to challenge systemic racism and the police brutality that is against Black folks and targeting them. I want to bring in another piece of that equation of the work that we need to do that's related to this space, which is toxic masculinity. It is a buzzword. People use this all the time online, and I think that I really want to give us an opportunity to get into what that actually means, because it has some very serious consequences for our society, historically, in the present, in the future. And so I'm really excited to have our guest on today. Hi, Kanoa.
Hi.
So I'm gonna awkwardly read your bio to you while you're here with me.
Oh, good.
So Kanoa Arteaga is a Mahu. Did I say that right?
You're good.
Great. Is a Mahu person, which we will explain what that means in a minute. In 2012, they founded two organizations aimed at uplifting the lives of queer and trans people of color, Lead ATX, an anti-racist reading and discussion group, and the Queer Cumbia on Tejas, a monthly queer trans people of color dance party, which sounds awesome. Today he leads Trans Lifeline's microgrants program, which disperses small grants to cover the cost to update name and gender markers on identifying legal documents. That's a lot of stuff, buddy.
Yeah, I stay busy.
Yeah.
To be fair, Lead ATX and Queer Cumbia were things that I started in around like 2013, 2014, and stopped when I moved back to the Bay Area. Might be revamping, relaunching, maybe entertaining those ideas.
Nice.
But that was sort of like my entry work to community organizing spaces. And Mahu, just to sort of explain that for folks, is the third gender category from Native Hawaiians, Native Hawaiian culture, and describes folks who have both like feminine and masculine energies and experience that like as like whole people. So
cool. That's awesome.
Trans masculine is sort of like the closest
I
give folks.
Yeah, that's helpful. That's definitely helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
So this is a big topic. when we talked about talking about this, like that also kind of took over, and there's so many different ways to get into this, but I want to try and keep this, I think that again, like the intro I said, that a lot of people have heard the word toxic masculinity. They've heard it degraded, like used as a oh, everything's toxic, dismissive, as a dismissive attack on folks. So I kind of want to break down, like, what does toxic masculinity actually mean? What are we talking about when we use that phrase?
Yeah, totally. So I want to like really just sort of like start off by acknowledging that, like, what the violence that we're seeing in the world today is like absolutely informed by toxic masculinity, right? Like the police state is absolutely like supported by this idea that like men's roles are to like control other people's bodies and to like protect private property. That's absolutely deeply entrenched in toxic masculinity. And when I think about toxic masculinity, I think about masculinity that really hinges on the subjugation of women and femmes, right? So masculinity that really like is really dependent on objectifying and harming others. And so oftentimes the first disclaimer that I have to give folks is that not all masculinity looks like this, right? Because I think that's sort of the place that people jump to right away, is that, well, what about this kind of masculinity, or like my dad isn't like that, or like I'm not like that. And also toxic masculinity is so insidious that it is very likely that we are not aware of the ways in which we are replicating the behaviors that are really inherently toxic and absolutely tied to our masculinity. Because it's just been so normalized, right? It's in the air we breathe. It's in the movies we watch. It's in the TV shows that we consume. It's in the books that we read.
I would just recommend folks, if you want to learn more about like different types of masculinities, if you want to get into some of that, R.W. Connell's gender order. Gender theories are some of the first early theories around this, and she identified hegemonic masculinity as the like kind of what we're talking about a little bit. It's very related, but that there are other types of masculinities. I mean, obviously, but I think that might be a new concept for a lot of folks. So that is one like very early, even if you just Google hegemonic masculinity, that could be a helpful starting point for folks who are interested in this conversation.
Yeah, and I really like the definition that the Good Men Project uses, which is that toxic masculinity is a narrow and repressive description of manhood, and it really designates manhood as defined by violence, sex, status, and aggression. The cultural idea of manliness, where there's everything, while emotions are a weakness, where sex and brutality are the yardsticks by which men are measured, while supposedly feminine traits, which can range from emotional vulnerability to simply not being hypersexual, are the means by which your status as man can be taken away, right? And I think even without, any sort of like formal understanding or introduction to like all of the nitty gritty bits and pieces of like what is masculinity, what is toxic masculinity in the larger context of the world that we live in, I think most of these things probably feel very familiar to men who are trying to navigate patriarchy, right? This world where like masculinity is really privileged and femininity is really demeaned.
Yeah, absolutely. So like, how does this play out? Like, what is it? How does it interact in our lives, in your life, right? In everyone's lives around us, both if inhabiting masculine bodies, inhabiting traits, like, the media does a really good job of being like, gender roles here, they're clearly defined, right? And in some ways like that is such a big influence on how we exist in the world and how we interact with each other based on gender identity.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I can give sort of like my entry point to like doing this work, which is just as a short sort of like anecdote, in 2016, I was like a year into my dream job at a queer and trans youth center in the Bay Area. And everything was like really great. I was like really riding on a high. And then one day while I was driving home, I was listening to NPR, completely unrelated story that was like not tugging at my heartstrings in any way. And I just started crying like uncontrollably, like completely unprompted. And it really forced me to sort of come to terms with like an inner turmoil that I had really kept buried and was now beginning to surface, right? And so I got myself into therapy. I started doing the work of unpacking all of the terrible coping mechanisms that were no longer serving me in the way that they used to. And during my time in therapy, I actually found that the primary thing that I struggled with was building deep and meaningful connections and reaching out for help when I needed it. And I found that was directly tied to the ways that I was trying to navigate, being a man in the world.
Yeah.
Right? That I had completely internalized this idea that it's never okay for men to reach out for help when we need it. And whatever we're going through, we have to go through alone. And that vulnerability was weakness, right? And I'm someone who like identifies as a crybaby. Like I watch, rom-coms are like my favorite genre of movie because for all the like sappy sweetness, like
yeah.
I really enjoy vulnerability as a practice, and still toxic masculinity was so insidious, even with all of that awareness, that I still ended up being a victim of its trappings, right? And it really felt like it cheapened my experience as like a whole person, right? There's a really great model. I have some notes that that I'm referencing here. So it's called the male emotional funnel system, right? And so it takes like the full breadth of human emotion, right? So that, admiration, adoration, nostalgia, excitement, calmness, sympathy, sadness, all of that. And for men, like it funnels it down into two things, and that's anger and pride. And those are the only things that we are allowed to express outwardly in the world, right? And that is essentially what it felt like happened for me, where I knew my experience to be incredibly complex and important. I knew my story and my struggles to be things that were valid and needed to be acknowledged and uplifted. But I managed to internalize toxic masculinity so well that I really only allowed myself to show like a handful of emotions to the world. And that really, really limited me when it came to asking for support when I needed it.
Yeah.
And I think that we see this, we know that this is true because loneliness is an epidemic that one is really lethal, right? It's experts have suggested that it is as lethal as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And it is a particular problem for men. And considering what we know about the messages that we get from toxic masculinity, it's not a surprise that it would impact men more than women.
Yeah, and this is a little bit of a tangent, but I think we're not going to talk about internalized sexism in this episode because that's a lot. But like when you're talking about the funnel, I wrote my my graduate thesis on the representation of strong female characters in sci-fi television shows, and what I did was I broke apart the gendered stereotypes of traditionally masculine, traditionally feminine, and the traits that we value in society in both men and women are. I was just doing representations of men and women, not to say that those are the only genders. That even in these female characters that we're like, they're the best, we want more of these, they're all masculine, stereotypically masculine traits, right? We denigrate traits that are about stereotypically feminine, like compassion and vulnerability and cooperation and all of those things, while we really value being alone, being stoic, not showing emotions, right? Like the media is so saturated with these messages, and like when you think about the media, it's cyclical, right? Like we as a society put forth these values and the media adopts them and perpetuates them, and it keeps going around. And so, it's not like women or femme folks are immune from this as well, right? We live in the same culture that is valuing these harmful traits.
Yeah, totally. And really sort of like underlines this idea that like identity politics or someone's like or representation of just having women on screen, just having like men on screen is not the end of it, right? Like just having people of color on screen doesn't mean anything if the way those characters are written is upholding white supremacy.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely.
Like if those characters are espousing the same ideals that like their like white counterparts are espousing, right?
Yeah.
And actually doesn't paint a complete picture of like what of the healing that representation can do.
I remember in the height of doing some of the video game analysis that I was doing, when I would talk about a female character who is hypersexualized, I would get a lot of pushback from people who are like, but that was designed by a woman. And I'm like, yeah, and it's still harmful. Like, it still has the same impact. It's still harmful. It's not like, there's a sense that they want, like, folks want to lump any identity category as like one person can speak for everyone. And I think that that's extremely harmful and not accurate at all. Yeah. So. Anyways, I did just want to bring up the fact that like we internalize these messages and we internalize who's valued, right? And even when we look through to issues around, even the like lean in bullshit or like, these are very masculine. These are stereotypically masculine traits of like, you need to talk a certain way and be a certain level of aggressive in order to make it in business, right? Like those sorts of things. So, just kind of want to put that out there as food for thought for folks who might be like identifying with some of the things you're saying, but also might not identify with being masculine,
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And what a shame that, that I think like the message that folks will get, the pushback to like, you're not being aggressive enough, you're not being assertive enough in, in a corporate sort of like world, is that it's their fault, right? It's their fault for not playing this role, or not holding these traits that the world sort of privileges and upholds.
So can you talk a little bit about like some men get, not all men.
Oh, we gotta go there.
Oh, it was bound to happen. But
Yes.
but there are some men who get really mad when you talk about toxic masculinity, when you talk about getting called out on, harmful behavior. Like can you go into some of that? Like why do men react so badly to that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think there are lots of reasons why, obviously. I think that at the core of it is that for someone who's staked their entire sense of self-worth on a system that harms, to have to take responsibility for the harm that causes would mean to have to acknowledge that their sense of self-worth is based on something that is like false, or like it's not doing good in the world, right? And that is really, really hard for people to come to terms with. Really, really hard. I think that we're probably seeing a lot of similar conversations happening around abolishing the police, right? Yeah. Like people are convinced that the police is a system that is designed that does good in the world, right? And what we're actually seeing from Black Lives Matter and other Black liberation movements is that actually, like, no, it causes a lot of harm, and so there's no way to reconcile the harm that the police state causes with your idea that you're individually a good person. And I think that conversation is similar to the struggle that men have when we are confronted with this idea that, like, individually we might be good people, but the behaviors that we have taken on because we consider it to be wholeheartedly a part of like who we are as men, actually like cause a lot of harm to the people that we care about, right? Yeah. And it's not that we have to toss aside every single aspect of our masculinity, right? Like there are aspects of my masculinity that I absolutely have like a very like loving and caring relationship with. And it's about taking a closer look at what are the behaviors. I think that's important to sort of name, right? Like there's your masculinity, your masculine identity as a person, and then there's the behaviors that have an impact on your world and the people around you, right? And that's what we're talking about when we're talking about addressing toxic masculinity. We're talking about addressing the behaviors that cause harm, right? And really trying to separate out, like, you are not toxic as a person. I mean, there are toxic people out in the world, right? But like, I think
yes, yes,
there are toxic people. Like, I mean, that's absolutely true. But like, to really get fixated on this idea that like finding alternatives to toxic masculinity means that we are telling whole people that they are inherently toxic and bad, really shuts down the conversation really quickly in a way that is really unfair, and doesn't get us any closer to a more just, more liberated world.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you're talking, you're talking about prison abolition, but I think that what you're talking about is related to any kind of privilege, right? That people with any type of privilege, white privilege is a very big thing that people are being confronted with right now. Some people for the first time, and the defensiveness of like, well, I didn't own slaves, so who am I? And I'm just like, oh, that's not the point. But also, how do we, like, how do you, everything I'm about to say, I'm like, oh no, don't say that. So the reason I'm hedging is because I want to offer folks the opportunity to have patience with some people around some of these issues. But I'm just like, well, if you're a Nazi, like, you don't get patience, right? But putting that aside, right? Like, yes. Not that goes aside. I feel like I'm just saying everything wrong today. It's fine.
It's okay. We can fumble together.
Yeah, we'll fumble together. But I feel like that for a lot of us who have been in this work for decades, like, realizing that when we first got into it, it was, like we needed to have people have patience with us and walk us through some of this process. And so, for example, like I'm in the middle of dealing with someone in my community being called out for harm and abuse, and acknowledging my own complicity in that, and trying to get everyone else in our community to recognize that they need to step up now. Right. Like, people have come forward about the harm. It's out there. It's public. How much patience do we have for those people when I got to do that privately for a while, right? I got to go through that process privately. And so just thinking about that in terms of like when we do address issues of toxic masculinity in our communities and people in our lives, you can't expect them to know all of the words and all of the concepts and not feel defensive immediately. But I think how people react to that, and it is very telling, right? If they're reacting with the toxic behaviors that are leading you to have that conversation, then like that's a problem in and of itself. I'm derailing us a little bit, but I think that there are people in our community who like want to have these conversations and are finding them very difficult to have, right? It gets very antagonistic.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, I think what you're pointing to is a really important part of this conversation, which is who is entitled to whose emotional labor.
Yeah.
Right? Because when we're talking about the we of like, how can we expect, or like what do we expect from these folks? It's important to delineate who, right? Because when we're talking about groups that historically have been harmed by toxic masculinity, so we're talking about women and femmes, men have felt really entitled to emotional labor from women and femmes in holding men accountable to their toxic masculinity, right? Explain to me how. Like, show me the receipts. Like, show me exactly when, where, and how. Draw me a diagram. Like, send me the resources. Send me the link. Write a handbook for me, right? And those are the exact same behaviors that we see from white folks when we're talking about white privilege, right?
Yes.
And so when we start to talk about like men who, really like perform a certain level of like wokeness around their white privilege or racial justice, right? We should really expect the same level of like nuance and ability and grace and gratitude when those men are receiving feedback about the ways in which their behavior as men has caused harm, right? And so I think, I just think that really being clear about who is the we that we're talking about when we talk about like what we can expect from men, right? Because I don't think, right, like it replicates this unfair like this imbalance of like emotional labor to like put that work on like women and femmes. And what we really need is men to really step up and to hold one another accountable in those conversations.
Yeah.
And it is my hope that eventually we will get to a place one day where we will all know a man or a masculine person in our lives who is more than willing to step in and do that work of holding other men accountable when the time comes.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for clarifying that, because I think that is very important. Of who's doing what labor is a very important question to constantly be asking ourselves in our various communities based on our own sites of privilege and oppression. There's a question in chat, if I can pop that up.
Sure.
It says, how do you navigate the intersection of whiteness / toxic masculinity with folks who aren't friends to you?
Who are not friends to you? I wish I had more information about this question. If I had to guess, like we're talking about like maybe folks who are like more public figures who we want to like hold accountable.
Sparkly Kiss, if you want to throw in a little more detail on that question, we can come back to that. That might be easier. Because I was kind of like, is it public people? Is it people just in your extended community? So right. Tell us more, and we'll come back to it. I do want to get into a little bit of like, what do we do, right? Like, now that we've figured it out and we understand all of it, but no, really, like, whether you're new to understanding toxic masculinity right now, or it's something that you've been thinking about and worrying about, what are some things that folks can walk away from this with in their daily lives?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I think that's like super, super important, you know. And I'm going to speak to sort of like the aspects of a healthy masculinity that have been really helpful for me. That's not to say that it's gonna be the same for everyone, but these are the things that have been helpful for me. I think like understanding that men are really like not given any role models when it comes to effective communication when we're in relationship or in friendship with other folks, right? And that there's going to be a huge like learning curve for us when it comes to learning how to communicate, and really understanding that communication is a skill that requires practice. Like we have to keep coming back to it. We have to keep, you know, being brave enough to try and willing to make mistakes, and to hold ourselves really gently when we inevitably do make mistakes, because we will, right? I think also like understanding vulnerability as like a strength that requires courage and patience, right? I think about the work of Brene Brown, who asks often in her talks, you know, raise your hand if you think vulnerability is weakness. And then raise your hand if you've seen someone be vulnerable in a way that required courage and bravery. And then asking the question, so how could it be that vulnerability is weakness and that it also requires courage and bravery?
I love that. I love that she does that. You know, like it's just so apparent and obvious.
Yeah, it just really cuts right to the heart of the contradiction, right? Like those two things like can't actually reconcile one another, right? And so we really need to work hard to like build empathy with ourselves and with the people around us, right? Like I think men are often identify very much with like feeling the need to be a fixer, and I think that actually works against us when it comes to building empathy, because building empathy really asks us to sit with hard shit. Like sit with discomfort, sit with emotions that really don't feel good, and don't offer solutions. Don't jump into offering solutions, because oftentimes all people need is to just be like seen and acknowledged and validated in their pain.
Yeah,
right.
Absolutely. As someone who has been in several relationships with cis white dudes, which might be my problem. One of the things that I was thinking about is how a lot of times men are unwilling to have those kinds of vulnerable conversations with their friends, or even to have friends that they talk to about things. And so the onus is put on their partners to be their therapist and their like emotional rock constantly. So like, don't do that. You know, and that's part of it, is like, how do you break down, like, I've had partners who have been like, I'm trying to reach out to my male friends, but it's awkward because they don't want to do the work, right? Or, you know, like it's, how do you build those communities, right? And you need other folks who are willing to sit in that uncomfortable space with you, you know?
Totally. Yeah. And it may be that you don't find that with your friends right away, right? Like it may be that like all of the men and masculine folks in your world are not ready to go there with you yet. And it may be that you have to find that either in therapy or in a support group or in some other like social connection like context. But those men are out there.
They are out there. And more than ever. Like, honestly, that the conversations that are happening around masculinity now weren't happening a decade ago. Like, there are many more opportunities to plug into those spaces. There are some really great, I have some friends who are in men's groups that are just like monthly or weekly get-togethers of men talking about their feelings and like talking about these issues together, and not putting the onus on women and femme folks to do that work for you. So like seek those groups out, but be careful that you don't fall into the like MRA, like the men's rights activist shit.
Right. That Venn diagram, I wonder what's the overlap between those.
For sure.
And I will say, like, now that our world is increasingly more and more virtual, there are less excuses for men to say that they don't have that in their area.
Yeah.
Because if it doesn't exist in your area, it's online somewhere.
Yeah.
Right.
Totally. Yep.
But I think those resources are out there. I really do.
So Sparkly Kiss got back to us with their question. So the question was, how do you navigate the intersection of whiteness / toxic masculinity with folks who aren't friends to you? And the context is more public figures, colleagues in your industry, just anyone who might orbit the same space as you.
Yeah, I think that it really sort of depends on like I think like what the power dynamic is, but I think that a really great first place to start is curiosity, right? Like just asking, like, this is the behavior that I observed, and I'm wondering what was going on for you, and really giving folks space to say, like, to really explain like what was all of the emotional like context that was happening before that even happened that led to the harm in the first place, or the behavior that is problematic in the first place, right?
And this also, I think, can be split up too between the like, who are we talking about, whether you are a part of that intersection or not, or if you are part of harmed parties in that space or not.
Yeah,
Makes
absolutely. Yeah, like take on the labor within your means, like within your capacity, and also like recognize who is part of like who you would consider like your community, and a community of folks that like need to be gathered, or like held accountable in that moment.
Yeah. Totally. I'm gonna throw up one more question, then maybe we can get back to a couple more takeaways. So this question is, should mask queer, trans, people of color engage in de-radicalizing in white toxic masculinity spaces such as like online Nazis, internet edgelords, and general bigoted youth?
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, so the question is,
should like queer, should some of the people who are targeted but who are masculine engage in the work of de-radicalizing these white spaces? People who are like in these, they're saying generally bigoted youth, but I would say that this goes across age ranges when it comes to like shitty internet behavior. Gosh, I think it just depends on like the situation. I think you have to really sort of calculate the risks involved, right? Like if you are part of a marginalized community entering into a space that you will be the intended target of, like you have to do some calculating about like what is the risk here, and probably do some planning around like what does my self-care look like if I end up feeling really harmed by what I encounter, right? Because our identities are complex, right? Like I might go to like call out like another like white trans masculine person on their behavior and experience some like really shitty like racist slurs or attitudes directed at me, and I think like we all need to have a plan for how do we stay engaged and take care of ourselves even when we're doing the really hard and necessary work, right?
Yeah, I think that's really important. I know that these are really big questions. People like, there aren't simple answers to these questions. So thank you for you're doing a really good job of trying to break them down. Yeah, because there isn't a one size fits all to any of this, and I think that's also what folks are learning right now that are maybe being radicalized for the first times, or being politicized at least for the first times. Of like, yeah, you're probably gonna fuck up, or you might enter a space and not like what that feels like, or and that might be because you are targeted in that space. It might be because you're being called out in that space. Those are very different ways of operating in this general area. And so like, there isn't clean answers to any of this.
No. And I think I run into this problem a lot, or this conversation a lot, when I'm talking to like white folks or cis folks who like want to do the right thing and feel really frozen in their anxieties about doing the wrong thing. To which I say, assume you will do the wrong thing. Just start from there. Just start from the assumption that it's going to happen and that you will be okay, right? I think the other question that comes up for people is like, okay, but am I going to be able to forgive myself if I fuck up?
Yeah.
And that's the part that people really struggle with, right? Like, not the will I fuck up, but when I do, will I be able to forgive myself and still hold myself with a lot of gentleness and kindness, and still continue on this work and not shut down,
Yeah.
when I receive really hard feedback.
Shame is powerful, y'all. And I've seen shame work in ways that really brought people to understand their privilege, right? Like, you know, I have been in spaces and been in communities that have publicly called folks out, and they learned from that. And it sucked for them. And now they're, you know, they're doing the work and they're being a part of it. But like, that's the, I think the underlying current here is people don't want to feel ashamed. They don't want to be shamed. They don't want to be called out. And also adding to that is right now, there is a very unforgiving nature on the internet. If you do something wrong, you're kind of exiled forever in a lot of ways. And that's another conversation that I think needs to be unpacked and that lots of people are trying to have. But I think that it's really critical that we allow people the space to be to grow and reduce harm. And you know, like, man, I said some stupid shit when I was a young activist, like just like deeply embarrassing in front of like rooms full of people that were just wrong and inappropriate, and then they would try and tell me to like go back to my community, and I didn't know what that meant, and I was like, this is my community. It was not a pretty scene, y'all. But like I needed to go through that, right? I needed to be called out and I needed to have that experience. I'm really lucky that it was not digital and it's not recorded forever. But I think that like, I put that out there. Like, I just really need folks to understand that it doesn't feel good and that's okay. You know, and like the thing is that the people who are being targeted by the harmful words that you may have said or the poor behavior have been not feeling good for a really long time.
Yeah. I think that's important to highlight, right? That like marginalized folks have been waiting for generations for people in power to do the right thing.
Yeah.
And they have waited for generations. And nowhere in history is there an example of someone who had the power to do the right thing and did it just unprompted out of the goodness of their heart. They did it because they got some really, really difficult feedback from the people who were suffering and struggling, right? And you know, I also want to say like about shame, like bringing it back to Brene Brown because she's brilliant. You know, the one thing I know about shame is that it really cannot stand to be named, right? So if we name it and we acknowledge it, then we're already doing something to heal from it and to offer something, you know, like more beautiful and more restorative to the world than a shame spiral, because that doesn't do anybody any good.
And this goes to the whole, like what you were talking about is one of the tips is like, or like, you know, building a community, like having community, having friends, having people you can talk to, right? Like have your men's group, have your whatever that you're going to call that's not your partner that can be like, I fucked up. Can I sit in this with you? Right. And it's not to get people who are like, no, you didn't. It's to get people who are like, yeah, you did. And I'm here for you still. Right.
Yes.
You're still worthy of being loved. But you need to get your shit together, you know?
Yeah. Like I see you in all your shame and you're still human that's worthy of love and kindness.
Yeah,
right.
Totally. So
there's not enough of that.
Yeah, I know. And also again, I will encourage folks to ask whose labor it is to do that work, right? Like I don't expect folks who have been harmed to give a shit about someone else's shame in that space at all. But so yeah, you know, just feel like I just need to say that one again. So what are there other things that you want to share that folks can do?
I have a laundry list.
Let's do it.
I mean, I think for me, really understanding the importance of like self-reflection, right? Like being able to really pause and interrogate what's happening beneath all of those knee-jerk defensive reactions, right? Like we were talking about, really building an ecosystem of supportive friends outside of our romantic partnerships, really committing to acknowledging wrongdoing, figuring out what's going on internally and making sure that it doesn't happen again, and really doing more to balance those scales of emotional labor.
Yeah, absolutely.
When I think about, I feel like an important piece of this is also like sexual health and wellness, because like men's like sexual aggression is just like, you know, such a core component, like piece of toxic masculinity, right? And so I think we really need to do more to interrogate our unrealistic expectations that we have of ourselves and our bodies, right? And that means unlearning fat phobia, and connecting our like particular body types with the body types of our ancestors, right? I know a mantra that's been really helpful for me is like remembering, even though I might not see my body type out in the world represented in media, I try to remember that there's always been a body like mine, right? Mm-hmm. Like throughout my entire lineage, there has always been a body that looks like mine, right? And really sort of like challenging ourselves to really acknowledge and start to dismantle the fat phobia that really pervades so many of the unrealistic expectations that we internalize around what men's bodies should look like, right? I think like also like cultivating kindness and acceptance and even celebration for all the ways that we don't measure up to these like unattainable standards of like male masculine beauty, like understanding the really dangerous and toxic scripts we've been taught about male sexuality, and really developing sexual practices that are deeply, deeply rooted in consent and pleasure and equity.
Yes.
Those are the things that have been helpful for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of this is personal things that people can do in their own lives. And I think, you know, coming back to the idea of the personal is political, like this work is really, really important. I often think about this statement from Bell Hooks about how she talks about, and this is not to create a hierarchy of oppression, but she talks about how you are, as women or femme folks, we are raised in households with our oppressor. Right. And I come back to that a lot in terms of like, not necessarily that your dad or your brothers or your uncles are harming you, although that is a reality, but that like in the power structures of the world, you're so intimately intertwined with them in this space. And I think about how important it is for folks to do this work, because you are living with the people that you hold power over, right? You're living and interacting with constantly. So if you can start doing these little things to start breaking down those power structures, to start recognizing the fuck ton of crap that you've been taking in for your entire life that's been telling you lies, that work in and of itself is incredibly valuable.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I feel like I wanna make sure to get in this last little bit of my laundry list.
Yeah, please do.
I feel like it connects really beautifully to like what you're talking about. I think like I really try to like challenge myself to think about masculinity through this lens of like cultural health and wellness, right? And really putting the responsibility on men to really change the narrative of what it means to be masculine or man enough, right? And also locating really healthy masculinities within our lineages, right? Like, and it might not be, you know, a healthy masculinity according to like all of the standards that we're talking about today, but it might be, you know, an uncle who like never engaged in locker room talk. It might be, you know, a grandfather who like always did the dishes after dinner, or you know, tried to find some way to like balance the scales of like what household labor looks like and who takes it on, right? Those little pieces, I think, like really beautifully connect us to a history and an inherited history of men who have you know tried to find some sort of like masculinity that didn't hinge upon this like really deep chasm of like power imbalance between like men and women and femme folks, right?
Yeah.
I think also when we're talking about, you know, I think when we initially started talking about this and, you know, started thinking about the pandemic and like how it's impacting folks who are, you know, maybe really dependent on unemployment right now, have lost their jobs. I think about the idea that we really need to see ourselves as contributors and not providers, right? Like this idea that we need to be breadwinners, that we need to provide financially for our families, and if we don't, we are less than as men, is really toxic, especially in this time when we can't depend on that, right? Like if my entire identity hinges on the fact that I have a good paying job that provides for, or that provides for like my entire family, and suddenly my access to that is limited or gone, I have no doubt that it's going to send me into a tailspin when it comes to like my emotional well-being,
Right.
right?
Which affects
And
everyone
so,
around you.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And so we really need to start like distancing ourselves from that idea that like our entire sense of self-worth really depends on our identities as breadwinners, right?
Yeah.
And I think also it goes to like affirming boys and men whose skills like fall outside of like traditionally masculine work, engaging in practices of restorative connection versus punitive isolation, right? Like really like reaching out and not pushing away when we see other men causing harm, getting away from resorting to exile or things that look like prisons as a way to restore justice or rehabilitate damaged community relationships, asking what justice looks like for survivors and what resources are needed and who is available. I think I try to come back to this other mantra that I try and remember, which is that like we are not to blame for the trauma we are experienced, but we are 100% responsible for our healing from it, right? And as we start to think about the next generation of men and masculine folks, I think this part is like really, really important. That we really need to take some responsibility for what our own healing looks like, and the healing that can do for our communities.
Absolutely. I think that's a lovely way to wrap up this conversation.
Great. I'm so glad we got it all in.
You're so good. You're so good at this. Well, we just solved this problem, and that's great. No, I thank you so much for coming on and start having this conversation with us, giving some folks things that they can do right now at this very moment in their own lives, because this is a holistic process. It's both internal and external, and community and solo, and it's messy. And I think that this conversation showed a lot of that, like a lot of the difficulties with this work. And so thank you for coming on and sharing that with us. Where can folks find out more about you, or what you're working on, or what you're excited about right now?
Yeah, for sure. So I work in the microgrants program at Trans Lifeline. So you can follow our work on Instagram or on Facebook, or on our website. And folks are also welcome to follow me on Instagram. That would be helpful.
Cool. We'll definitely link.
You can
all
expect
this.
lots of pics of pets and maybe some selfies. Yeah.
That sounds delightful. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you being on.
Yeah, of course.
Bye.
Thank you so much, Anita.
Shout out to all of our mods for keeping this space friendly, because that's some real work that they have to do sometimes. And thank all of you for tuning in and spending this morning with us. You can watch these videos at any time at our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/gameshotline. And yeah, join us next week, where we're going to be talking to Dominique Morgan from Black and Pink, which is a prisoner abolitionist organization that supports LGBTQ and HIV positive prisoners, and talking a little bit about like, what is prison abolition? Why are we talking about defunding the police? What is that work actually look like? So we'll see you next week. Bye.